Hi, it's good to see you again. It's been more than a week since I recorded my last message. Even though I had this ready last week, we were able, with changes in the coronavirus environment, to open our church again. And so we were pretty busy last week getting ready for a reopening. But today, in my series on the manifestation gifts of the Holy Spirit, we're going to talk about miracles. Now, I want to start with a kind of a simple story. Someone came to our church a day that I preached, and the message I preached was really about a prayer rock that I carried in my pocket, a little pebble that reminded me of a prayer that I had prayed over a period of time, and God answered. And I continued to carry that pebble in my pocket for several years to remind me of what God had done for me, so I would have gratitude. And so this person was listening to that message, and I provided little pebbles for people to take that would represent things they were praying for. So the lady's name is Sylvia. She reported this to me a couple weeks later. She and her husband had been homeless for 4 years. So their car was very important to them. And they were going to take a drive up the pass here just north of Pomona to the high desert. And it's called the Cajon Pass. And they were going up this grade, and the car was having problems with its cooling system, and it was overheating, and they were very anxious about what was going to happen when she moved her hand and she felt that prayer rock that she had picked up to represent her prayer. And when she touched it, she felt a surge of faith to pray first for God to get them safely up the hill, and secondly, for them to find a place to live. Well, they made it to the top of the pass, and when they were in town, they took the car in to have it checked. And lo and behold, the coolant system was completely fine. It was fixed. There was nothing wrong with it. So she was all excited about that. But then a week later, God worked things out, and they were able to get into an apartment. They had been struggling 4 years to be able to live somewhere, and within a week of that prayer, they were in their new apartment. So what is a miracle? How do we measure what a miracle is? We've been reading in 1 Corinthians 12, 7 through 11 about the 9 manifestation gifts. And among them are a gift called workings of power, or what we've translated workings of miracles. Wayne Grudem describes miracles in his book, Systematic Theology, as, quote, a less common kind of God's activity in which he arouses people's awe and wonder and bears witness to himself. I might say that a miracle is God's intervention in the world that breaks natural laws in such a way as to create a sense of marvel or wonder in the people that are aware of the miracle. Like the gifts of healings, this gift is also in total plurality, so it's workings of miracles. So I think this suggests that there are a vast number of possibilities for miraculous workings by God. So let me give you my definition of the gift. It's the demonstration of the power of God through an act or command. Now, there are related words that we find listed all the time when miracles are being talked about. And Paul indicates that one of the marks of an apostle is miracles. That's in 2 Corinthians 12:12. I persevered in demonstrating among you the marks of a true apostle, including signs, wonders, and miracles. You notice that that's what made people know that you were an apostle. You worked signs, wonders, and miracles. So the term signs and wonders is often used with the word miracles, or even as a substitute for the word miracles. So a sign is something that we see that points to something that we can't see. For instance, a stop sign indicates that there is a law requiring us to stop our car at this spot before proceeding. So you see the sign, which is visible, points to something that is invisible. At the time of Jesus, the Jews used the word sign in a very technical sense. Excuse me. Even though they saw Jesus performing miracles, the Jews wanted to see what they called a sign. Now, he'd healed the deaf, he'd raised the dead, he'd brought recovery of sight to the blind. But they wanted to see something what they meant by sign is they wanted to see something that was a heavenly witness to validate that Jesus was the Messiah, something he could not himself manipulate, like an eclipse or a comet or something that was not dependent on Jesus himself. Let me read from Matthew 16, verses 1 through 4. The Pharisees and Sadducees came to Jesus and tested him by asking him to show them a sign from heaven. He replied, "When evening comes, you say, 'It will be fair weather, for the sky is red.' And in the morning, 'Today it will be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast.' You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but you cannot interpret the signs of the times. A wicked and adulterous generation looks for a sign, but none will be given it except the sign of Jonah." Jesus then left them and went away. And we know the sign of Jonah was that 3 days in the belly of the fish, he was then brought forth to do ministry. Now, along with signs, we have the word wonder. A wonder is an act of God that amazes people so that they marvel at it. For instance, at the end of Jesus' Galilean ministry, in Luke 9, it says that everyone was marveling at all that Jesus did. I actually think this is a summary verse for the first part of the book and a summary of his ministry in Galilee. So Luke especially loves using the term signs and wonders to describe the ministry of Jesus. And then in the book of Acts, he uses signs and wonders to describe the ministry of Jesus through the disciples. Acts 5:12, the apostles performed many signs and wonders among the people. So the term signs and wonders is actually taken directly from the Old Testament, especially in reference to the miraculous ministry of Moses through the 10 miracles that he performed before Pharaoh, and then culminating in the parting of the Red Sea. Let me read from Jeremiah 32:20 and 21, which Jeremiah is referring back to the signs and wonders that Moses performed. "You performed signs and wonders in Egypt and have continued them to this day, in Israel and among all mankind, and have gained the renown that is still yours. You brought your people Israel out of Egypt with signs and wonders, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, and with great terror." Once again, that was Jeremiah 32:20 and 21. Now, before we go on, I think it's important that we talk about another term, and that is worldview. In our Western world, we have tended to minimize anything that is supernatural or miraculous. We have what I call a Western scientific rational worldview. We've been raised to believe that science can explain everything, that there's a rational explanation when something happens that maybe appears to be supernatural, but science eventually will show us that there's a natural explanation. If I have a fever and you pray for me and the next day I feel better, I have this nagging sense that, well, I was probably already getting better and I got a good night's rest and that helped me get better. My mind instantly tries to explain everything you see through a scientific and rational worldview. The problem for Western Christians is that the Bible does not have a Western scientific rational worldview. It is written with a worldview that acknowledges the reality of God, the reality of angels, the reality of demons, and the reality of the miraculous. Many people who grow up in non-Western countries have an easier time accepting the supernatural and accepting miracles. If we're going to become biblical Christians, we are going to have to develop a biblical worldview, and in some ways that will mean letting go of some of our Western scientific rational prejudices or worldview. Now let's talk about miracles. There are generally different types of miracles, and the first I want to mention is tied to my last lesson, and that is miracles of healing. As we said last week, many of the healings that Jesus and the disciples performed are called miracles. So there's a miraculous quality to all healings, of course. But for our purpose, remember last time I defined the gifts of healings as the ability to lay hands on the sick so that they are healed or recover from their condition. But remember, miracles are initiated by an act or a command. The gifts of healings are usually administered through the laying on of hands. So a good example of a miracle of healing is the man with the withered hand in Mark 3:5. He looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." So there's the command, stretch out your hand. He stretched it out and his hand was completely restored. So Jesus commands things many times, and often those are tied to incredible miraculous healings. Another type of miracle is the casting out of spirits, or the casting out of demons, the expelling of demons. Now we're going to talk more about that next week, because next week's lesson is on deliverance, and once again that'll be a lesson that actually integrates several of the gifts into one topic. So when you give a command to a demon to leave, that is a working of miracles. Once again, we'll talk about that next week. Now, there's also miracles of what I would call miracles of provision. Jesus performed 2 miracles where he multiplied bread and fish. The question is, did the miracle happen in his hands or in the hands of the disciples, or maybe it happened in both places? We know in the Old Testament, Elijah causes the oil and flour to continue for the widow of Zarephath. And in John's gospel, we're told that Jesus' first miracle is the changing of water into wine. Once again, Jesus commands the servants to take action, and the miracle happened as they obeyed. So there's a command, and it's not necessarily Jesus actually performing the miracle as much as commanding the miracle. Another miracle is when we break the laws of nature. So perhaps I think Moses may be the most profound worker of these kinds of miracles in the Bible, especially with the parting of the Red Sea. But he commands nature and other things to do things that they would not normally happen. Now, Jesus also performed these kinds of miracles, and most notably calming the storm, walking on the water, and multiplying the loaves and fish. Another type of miracle would be raising the dead. Elijah, Jesus, Peter, and Paul are all credited with raising the dead. Now, you may know Robbie Dawkins, who is a noted evangelist, and he reported an incident a couple years ago where he was doing meetings at a small church in England, and the church was packed out. In fact, I think there were more people in the church than that lived in the town. But a man fell over, was choking, and died in front of him. And Robbie felt a sense of anger at the enemy, what the enemy was doing to the country, what he was doing to this man. And he commanded the spirit of death to leave. The man stood up and began speaking to the room. And his mother, who was there, by the way, there was a doctor sitting right behind him. So we know the man died because the doctor checked him out before the miracle happened. And but the mother heard the man talking, and she said, "He can speak." You see, before he came to the meeting, he had had strokes, and he was only very carefully able to say like yes and no. But all of a sudden, he was completely verbal, his tongue was loosed, and he'd been raised back to life. So if you get a chance, you can watch you could put in Robbie Dawkins and miracle of raising the dead, and you'll probably find the video about that. He's told the story several times, and there was an article in Charisma about that very issue. I don't know about you, but I really want to raise the dead. That's on my list of things, my bucket list before I go to see the Lord. And let me talk about one other gift that's in our list in 1 Corinthians 12, 7 through 11. And it mentions there the gift of faith. Now, faith in this list has to be like the other things in the list. It's not the normal kind of faith that you have to be saved. This faith is faith that enables us to perform miracles. So the gift of faith enables us to wait on God to fulfill a promise or to perform something. We don't do an act, we don't do a command. We, by an incredible act of faith, wait on God. Let me tell you my definition of the gift of faith. It's the demonstration of the power of God through exceptional faith. Good example would be Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the book of Daniel. They were thrown into the fiery furnace. We know they expressed exceptional confidence in God. No matter what would happen, they were confident God could either save them, or if they were taken, they would be with God. The same is true of the story of Daniel in the lion's den. That's also an incredible story of faith. And so when we have this incredible amount of faith, we are accepting God's promise in a way that allows us to persevere with confidence, and then the miracle happens when God fulfills his promise. You know, I believe that people who have been martyred many times are exhibiting the gift of faith. They believe God to a degree that enables them to persevere and not deny the faith. Now, when Paul and Silas were thrown into prison in Philippi, they were singing hymns in the night. They were showing their confidence in God, and it led to a miracle of deliverance. The jail was shaken, the doors were open, their shackles fell off, and it was all because of their confidence in God, the gift of faith. The same is true of God promising to Paul that he would deliver him in the sea, in the storm, in Acts 27. And so he believes, and he tells the rest of the ship that if they will just conform to God's promise, that everyone will be saved. And we know that that actually was fulfilled. Now, I had a story of this kind of faith when one time I was a student. It was before I was married, and 3 of us decided to take a long trip to the Grand Canyon, Bryce Canyon, Zion Canyon, and it was very cold, and there was snow on the ground, and we ended up basically having, we didn't know, a leak in a fuel line that appeared in the wilderness, you could say, as we were trying to cross a ridge. And God just gave us the assurance that he was going to get us all the way to our destination. And so we were praying, but we believed God. We got to the ridge. There were no cars on the road. There were no gas stations. Nothing was open. Just the sound of the wind blowing the thick snow around. And when we got to the ridge, we put it into idle and started coasting down the mountain. And we knew that it was 15 miles till we got to our destination, and it was mostly downhill. But when we got to one place in the road, about 10 miles from town, there was going to be a dip in the road. The car was now out of gas. We were just coasting down the mountain. We got to that spot. The cliff on the left, the drop off on the right disappeared, and all of a sudden on the left side of us was a little Mel's Family Steakhouse. The fire was going, there was smoke coming out of the chimney, the lights were on. We coasted into the parking place by the front door. They let us use the phone. We called into town, we had AAA cards. We called into town. It was after 6 o'clock, but the tow truck driver just happened to be getting back. The place was deserted except for him. He answered the phone. He decided he'd come out and pick us up, towed us the 10 miles into town. Everything was miraculously taken care of. The hotel, even the cost of fixing the car ended up being $15. And back in those days, we were poor students, and we could scrape that $15 together, and we didn't miss a beat. We ended up back on the road. God provided every step of the way as we placed our confidence in him and believed that he had promised we would make it through the whole way. And it's actually a much longer story, but I don't want to bore you to death with that story. So we know that the working of miracles and the gift of faith often are paired with revelation gifts to tell us what God wants to do. And so the working of miracles almost always involves the operation of some revelation gift at some time in the process. It's God speaking to us that releases our obedient response. This leads to the actual miracle, whether through an act or command or through the gift of faith, or if it's a gift of healing, it's maybe through the laying on of hands. So with that said, that's our study on miracles. I want to go into a practical section again. It's impossible to try to control the operation of miracles. For this reason, the most important elements need to be, first, we have to learn how to hear God's voice. When you can hear God's voice and you have confidence that you can tell the difference between God's voice and your own inner thoughts or what other people are telling you, that's the first step. Secondly, we have to learn to take risks based on what God has spoken to us. Because the miracle is released when we step out in faith. And John Wimber used to say, faith is spelled R-I-S-K. The third thing we need is we need to learn to speak or act in obedience to God's prompting. So with that all said, I'm going to encourage you to get into a small group and worship God and sing directly to Him and express your heart of love and adoration and bask in His presence, because God's presence is a response to our worship. And as His presence is manifest, listen for words or pay attention to thoughts or images that you have in your mind. And then as a group, share them with one another. Now, I want you to do one other thing, and that is pray for one another. If you're in a large enough group and you get into groups of 3, then make sure that one person is receiving and the other 2 pray for that person. Deliver any revelation you have for them and pray for any needs they have. Then move to the other person, have 2 people pray for that person, and finally the last 2 people pray for the last person. In that way, everybody will receive prayer and everybody will have a couple opportunities to hear from God, to speak words of faith, and to pray for someone. So thank you for listening. I will be putting 2 more lessons together. The next one is on deliverance, and the final one you'll have to watch to find out. So God bless you.